So I was going to talk about the Orlando Magic and what they should do in the draft in this video, and I will get to that eventually. But when I started thinking about Trae Young for them, I realized that Trae Young is maybe the most controversial of all the guys who could get selected in the lottery. Just because, depending on who you're talking to, he's either a guy who could be one of the best players in the league in 5 years because of his shooting and his ball handling, his passing, and his abilities in the pick and roll. And then there are others who think physically he just can't make it in the NBA, right? Just won't be a good defender, doesn't have the athleticism to beat NBA defenders often enough, can't get into the paint, can't finish at the rim enough, and all that stuff. So I decided to just talk about Trae Young and nothing else, and that's what we're going to do for this video, because I do think him, maybe more than anybody else this high in the draft, so much of it could depend on the team that he ends up on, right? Because I look at a guy like, I don't know, Jared Jackson Jr., right? Like, if you can switch and you can hit threes and you're an athlete as a big guy, you're probably going to make it, or at least I feel like the margin for error determined by the team you end up on is a little smaller, whereas I think with Trae Young, it could end up being a bigger deal, just because if the team around him is just a bad defensive team, then he could have some problems, right? I've seen some mock drafts where the Cavaliers would select him. Now, whether the Cavs actually use that pick or not, I don't know. I mean, maybe they think it'd be more valuable to trade for someone. But if they decided to select Trae Young, they're like, look, his shooting can be good for us if LeBron stays, and if LeBron leaves, then we got ourselves a guy. I mean, Cleveland's been bad on defense for a while, and I mean, if LeBron did leave, then who knows what type of moves they make next, whether that's a complete tear down or try to still remain respectable, whatever it may be, they would have to get themselves a load of defensive players in there, right? Because even if Trae Young can grow into being like an okay enough defender, that'd be really tough to even have a somewhat respectable defense with him as your point guard there, right? I mean, we see it with Steph Curry right now, who has grown into a pretty okay defensive player. But you could make the argument that if he doesn't have Klay Thompson, Draymond, Iguodala, Harrison Barnes before, Kevin Durant now, if he doesn't have all these guys around him, then he probably doesn't have as much of a luxury to just play team defense, you know? Because he's just got a bunch of guys who can defend multiple positions. So if him and Iguodala are involved in like the same defensive play or whatever, Iguodala can he just makes it easier, you know, because he's such a good defensive player. But if Steph Curry ended up on, I don't know, let's say the Orlando Magic right now, with Vucevic at center and Evan Fournier at the 2, well, then you could have yourself some problems on defense, right? And that's a situation that Trae Young could potentially get drafted into. Now, I know Jonathan Isaac and Aaron Gordon, very interesting, but we can't act like that team is littered with just awesome defensive players. Now, one thing that will help Trae Young no matter where he goes is that among the 5 positions, the one you can afford to have a bad defender at the most is point guard, and you could slide Trae Young to defend someone else most games, but eventually you are going to run into some teams who either have too many talented players to where no matter who he's defending, he's on like a pretty good player, or they're just going to hunt him all the time. I mean, we're seeing that in this postseason right now, right? Where between the Cavaliers attacking Terry Rozier, the Rockets attacking Steph, the Warriors who were attacking Harden, but it feels like they didn't do it as much last night, although then again, Harden was legitimately good on defense last night too. But whatever, like, we're seeing the game plan that teams are going with right now, which, you know, eventually you're kind of forced to do if you're facing a good team who has a lot of tall defenders who switch everything. You have to resort to ISOs, and Trae Young could definitely get put in those situations. And if he's, you know, once again, if he's on a team that just doesn't have a lot of good defenders already, then the team who selects him could be setting themselves back a few years just on the defensive side of the floor. Now, his offensive potential, of course, very high. But to me, you could look at, like, Isaiah Thomas with the Celtics last season, right? Had as good of an offensive year as you can pretty much ask of a guy at that size. And, Trae Young's a little taller, I get it. But Isaiah was so bad on defense that he did still put a cap on how good that Celtics team could be. Now, truth be told, that Celtics team really wasn't that good. They were short. They had one guy who could create for himself, and, he did bail them out of some games, but still, they were like, 13th in defense or something like that, and a lot of it was because of him. I mean, the job that Stevens did with hiding him defensively was really impressive, and if Trae Young ends up with a head coach who's maybe just not that good, then that could also be a problem as well. And I guess I can talk about some of these other teams, because I did mention Orlando a little bit, if they would have drafted him. Most mock drafts don't start talking about Trae Young until around number 6, so I guess that's when I can start talking about him. If you look at the Chicago Bulls, for example, right? Would it make any sense at all for them to go with him? I talked yesterday about how I think Wendell Carter Jr. makes a lot of sense for them. I do think he'd be a better off-ball player than Zach LaVine, sure. There's also the case that Chris Dunn is a very good defensive player, so he could pick up the better of the two perimeter players on the other team and gives Trae Young a little bit of a break, and Young and Markkanen could have a really impressive two-man game. But then you'd still have that big hole at center, and I think when you have an opportunity to land yourself a good defensive 5, which is pretty much required to be a good defensive team today, then you should probably jump on that, especially when the other option, which could potentially be Trae Young for a team like Chicago, just has so much uncertainty. There is a chance that Trae Young becomes like just a bit better of a version of Lou Williams, or the season that Lou Williams had this year for the Clippers could be the prime of Trae Young, which is a nice player, but seems like some of these big guys in the upcoming draft are pretty damn good as well. So there's risk involved with this guy. I did mention the Cavaliers a bit, and if he was to slip down to the Knicks at number 9, I believe I talked about him a bit yesterday in this. Frank is a good defender, a very good one. Porzingis is good, but without that 5 and without too many switchy defenders, you just may be asking for too much. Now, offensively, you could be really damn good with Trae Young and Porzingis. And then after that, I don't think I've seen a mock draft where he goes below number 9. And I'm sure mock drafts have been wrong in the past, but I have to assume that the people making these know a bit more than I do. If there's a consensus among them that he goes somewhere between number 6 and number 9. So we'll assume that Philadelphia, Charlotte, and the Clippers, or if someone were to acquire those Clippers picks in some sort of a trade, do not have an opportunity to draft the guy. The other thing I want to talk about with Trae Young, because I've alluded to his offense a bit here, and how I think I've just kind of assumed oh yeah, dude's going to be there offensively. Is there a chance that his shooting and his overall game, which has been compared to Steph Curry, and probably a little unfairly because a lot of the time we compare Trae Young's freshman year to Steph Curry's junior season, but is there a chance that he's simply a shade below that in terms of shooting, getting his shot off, his quickness, getting the ball up over his head, and all that stuff, right? If that is the case, and one thing that I have seen is some people will say that his release is maybe a little too low to where there is some fear there, then you got yourself a decent enough problem, if you ask me, where if he's not going to check off the defense and stuff and improve in those areas, then you really could be looking at a sixth man kind of career for the guy, which is still good, but if that's the case, then where does he really belong in the draft, right? If I was an NBA GM and I believed that Trae Young was just meant to be this high teens kind of guy who could have some big games with some bad ones as well, then I may not want to use like a top 10 pick on the guy. I mean, it is dependent on what I feel about the rest of the draft, of course, but I think that is in play because it's just really difficult to be that successful with that style of play, right? And like actually be efficient and all that. So we'll just have to see. I hope this was at least a somewhat interesting thing on Trae Young. Just because, I don't know, the margin of how good he could end up being or how disappointing he could end up being may be the most drastic of any of the players here. I guess Bagley there's a chance because a lot of his praise is coming from his athleticism. But he's got to work on all the other stuff. Who knows, man? The draft is, there's always some randomness to it.